Myelodysplastic syndrome is a pretty new diagnosis, in fact. There's lots of bone marrow disorders, and maybe myelodysplastic syndrome is one of the syndromes that is just been completely characterized more recently. It's a group of disease, in fact, more than a real disease by itself. And it took quite a while to get all the determinants of the disease, all these subgroups types. Basically, we really get to the point where we can call this bone marrow disease myelodysplastic syndrome probably at the mid-70s, beginning of the 80s. Before that, it's interesting to know that they were defined as vitamin and iron-resistant anemia. And that's where comes the terms of refractory anemia, meaning refractory to vitamins and to iron. So it's quite ironic to see that now the most important question, one of the most important questions in myelodysplastic syndrome is to get rid of the iron, what it was a disease-defining event at the initial steps of understanding of the disease. What's interesting when we discuss about the evolution of the diagnosis of myelodysplastic syndromes was that over the last 20 to 25 years, we evolved from a purely morphologic classification that was initially just what we saw in the bone marrow that was driving the diagnosis of myelodysplastic syndromes, defining refractory anemia with excess of blast, to, in the mid-90s, a more cytogenetic-based classification, and now a classification that integrates also genomic factors and mutation in the definition of the disease. For example, the splicing factors mutations such as SF3B1 are beginning to be classifying or defining event as compared to what was previously, for example, the presence of ring sideroblasts, which is associated with SF3B1 mutations, for example. So that's a way that basically our classification, our understanding of the myelodysplastic syndrome has evolved since the 1970s. And with the classification and the evolution in our understanding of the myelodysplastic syndromes, our classification method and prognosis tools have evolved too. Initially, factors that were mostly important when we deal with myelodysplastic syndrome for classification and prognostication were the type of cytopenias that we were facing. Was it just anemia? Was it anemia plus other cytopenias such as neutropenia, thrombocytopenia? And two morphologic features in the bone marrow with basically the number of blasts that were present in the bone marrow biopsy and the bone marrow aspirate. With this cutoff value of initially 30% of bone marrow to differentiate acute myeloid leukemias and myelodysplastic syndromes that over the last years has been put down to only 20%. So when we switch from the FAB classification to the WHO classification in 2001. So now the classification as well as the prognostic factors mostly, one is morphology that still have a lot of importance in defining the prognosis of patients, especially the excess of blast. But as I mentioned previously, all the cytogenetics and molecular markers are now maybe the most important aspects of diagnosis and prognostication in myelodysplastic syndromes. For example, the presence of a deletion 5q that was initially associated with profound anemia, early onset of myelodysplastic syndromes, female gender, is no, and some specific characteristics on the bone marrow has not been identified under what we call the 5q syndrome. So that's a good example to see why this cytogenetic has such an importance and now beginning to be defining event. More recently, these molecular markers has been integrated in the prognostication and classification, especially for SF3B1, for example, and spliceosome mutation. And now that's really how we define myelodysplastic syndromes.